the diner breathed. It was a shallow, greasy respiration, the hum of the ancient beverage cooler, a rattling lung, the sizzle of bacon on the grill, a constant wet exhalation. Fluorescent tubes coated in a fine film of airborne fat cast a light the color of weak tea over the cracked red vinyl of the booths and the worn linoleum floor, a landscape of faded checkerboard squares. This was the world Ilara had chosen, or rather the world she had collapsed into, a space small enough and quiet enough to contain the shrunken geography of her life. She moved through the space not like a person, but like a current of air, no wasted motion. Her feet made almost no sound on the floor. When she picked up a plate, her fingers curled around the ceramic with a practiced economy. When she poured coffee, the stream was a silent, steady rod of black liquid that never splashed. She was 28, but she wore her anonymity like a uniform far more effective than the faded blue apron tied around her waist. Her face was a study in neutrality, her gray eyes holding a perpetual distance, observing everything and revealing nothing. Customers saw a waitress, competent and forgettable. The owner saw a reliable employee who never called in sick. No one saw the architecture beneath the surface, the load-bearing principles that held her upright. Her only point of anchor in the shifting, transient tide of customers was Arthur. He was a man made of tweed and time, his face a roadmap of 80 years, his hands knotted with arthritis, but still possessed of a deliberate grace. He came in every afternoon at 3, sat in the corner booth, and ordered a black coffee he would nurse for 2 hours. He never read the paper. Instead, he would pull a fine-tipped pen from his worn jacket and draw on the paper napkins Ilara provided. They were not doodles. They were problems of logic and space, chess endgames, geometric proofs, architectural puzzles. He would slide one across the table for her when she brought his coffee, a silent offering, a night's tour on a 6x6 grid, a question about the optimal placement of a supporting column in an irregular space. She never solved them in front of him, but sometimes, late at night in her small, bare apartment, she would take them out and her mind would remember how to move, how to see the lines of force, the vectors of stress, the elegant, inevitable path to a solution. Her father had taught her that. Everything, he used to say, his pencil scratching across drafting paper, is a structure, a conversation, a building, a life. Find the principles and you can understand it. Find the flaws and you can control it. Today, Arthur was working on a particularly complex problem, a fortress defense in a chess endgame, a lone king and a rook holding off a queen and a knight. It seemed impossible. He slid the napkin toward her as she set down his cup. His eyes, clouded with age, held a flicker of a challenge. She met his gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was the most conversation they ever had, and it was enough. She was wiping down the counter, the damp cloth moving in slow, even circles, when the sound of the diner changed. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the opposite. It was a subtraction of sound. The low chatter of the 2 tables of patrons faltered. The cook, a burly man named Sal, stopped whistling. The air itself seemed to thin, to hold its breath. Ilara didn't look up. She didn't need to. She could feel the pressure change, the way the atmosphere in a room warps around a center of gravity. A car door closed outside, a solid, expensive thud that was completely alien to the neighborhood's usual symphony of rattling mufflers and distant sirens, then another. Footsteps on the pavement, heavy and deliberate. The bell above the diner door didn't jingle. It gave a choked, metallic clank as the door was pushed open with authority. Two men entered first. They were dressed in suits that were trying too hard to look expensive, the fabric a little too shiny, the cut a little too tight across the shoulders. They didn't scan the room like security. They surveyed it like predators entering a feeding ground, their eyes flicking over the other customers with a dismissive contempt. They were the parentheses, the frame for the man who followed them in. He was not a large man, but he occupied the space of one. He wore a suit of charcoal wool so dark it seemed to absorb the weak light of the diner. It was tailored with a precision that spoke not of money, but of a deep understanding of form and line. His hair was silver at the temples, his face impassive, carved from something harder than flesh. He moved with a preternatural stillness, his presence a zone of silence. This was Mr. Valerius. He owned things, buildings, companies, people. His power was not in what he did, but in what he did not have to do. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to threaten. He simply was, and the world rearranged itself accordingly. Alara continued to wipe the counter. Her movements remained unchanged, slow, even circles. Inside her, however, something had gone still, a deep, cold watchfulness. She had spent 5 years cultivating invisibility, learning to be overlooked, to be nothing more than a pair of hands that brought food and cleared plates. It was a carefully constructed defense. Now a force had entered her small world that was an expert in seeing through such structures, in finding the hidden stress points. Valerius's eyes, dark and intelligent, swept the room once. They were not cruel eyes. They were worse. They were assessing. They took in the peeling paint, the worn-out booths, the tired faces of the other patrons. It was the gaze of a man evaluating an asset or a liability. His eyes passed over Alara without lingering, dismissing her as part of the worn-out scenery. Then they settled on the corner booth, the only one that was both empty and relatively clean. He slid into the vinyl seat without a sound. His two men remained standing, flanking the booth like crude, brutish statues. One of them, a man with a thick neck and a perpetually bored sneer, caught Alara's eye. He jerked his head toward the table. Coffee. It was not a request. It was an assumption of service. Alara picked up 3 clean cups and a fresh pot from the warmer. She walked toward the booth. Her shoes, sensible and soft-soled, made no sound. She felt the eyes of the other customers on her back, a weight of fear and morbid curiosity. They were afraid for her. They were afraid of the men. They were afraid of the disruption to the fragile peace of their afternoon. She placed the cups on the table, one in front of each man. Her hands were steady. She poured Valerius's coffee first, a smooth, dark stream. He gave a slight nod, a gesture so minimal it was almost imperceptible. She moved to the man on the left, the one who had barked the order. As she poured, he leaned back, ostentatiously creating space, his mouth twisted in a smirk. His name, she would later learn, was Marco. He was a man who mistook arrogance for strength. The diner held its collective breath. The only sounds were the clink of ceramic on formica and the low hum of the cooler. The air was thick with unspoken things, old power, new money, and the ever-present threat of casual violence. Alara moved within it like a diver in deep water, conserving her energy, her expression a perfect, unreadable calm. She was a ghost in a machine, and a predator had just entered the works. She did not know what would happen, only that the delicate, fragile structure of her quiet life was about to be tested. The third man, a hulking figure with knuckles like walnuts, remained silent, his eyes scanning the street outside the large plate glass window. He was the professional, the true muscle. Marco was the mouthpiece, the peacock, the kind of man whose cruelty was a function of his own insecurity. He took a loud sip of his coffee and grimaced. "This stuff is mud." He said it to his partner, but it was meant for the room, for Ilara. It was a casual assertion of dominance, a way of marking his territory. Valerius ignored him. His attention was fixed on something outside the diner, his gaze distant, his mind clearly on larger concerns than the quality of coffee in a place he would likely never visit again. He was a king, and this was merely a brief, distasteful stop in his kingdom's grimy periphery. His indifference was more intimidating than any overt threat. It rendered the diner and everyone in it utterly insignificant. It was this very insignificance that made Marco bolder. Boredom was a dangerous catalyst in a man like him. His eyes roamed the room looking for a distraction, a toy. They landed on the corner booth, on the old man in the tweed jacket, lost in his world of ink and paper. Arthur. Marco watched him for a moment, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Look at this guy." He nudged his partner. "What's he doing? Math homework?" He laughed, a short, ugly bark. Arthur didn't hear him or chose not to. His focus was absolute, his pen tracing a delicate line on the napkin, blocking the Queen's path of attack. The intensity of his concentration, his complete absorption in a world of pure logic, seemed to infuriate Marco. It was a form of dignity, a self-contained universe that Marco could not enter and therefore had to smash. He picked up his glass of water. His movements were slow, deliberate, performative. He leaned slightly out of the booth. Whoops! The word was thick with mock surprise. The glass tilted, and a stream of ice-cold water arced through the air, landing directly on the sleeve of Arthur's old tweed jacket and splashing across the napkin, blurring the intricate ink lines into a meaningless black smudge. The gasp from the other patrons was a collective, sharp intake of breath. Arthur flinched, not from the cold, but from the violation. He looked down at his soaked sleeve, then at the ruined napkin, his face a mask of confusion and quiet hurt. The fortress he had so carefully constructed had been breached by a casual, pointless act of malice. He looked up, his clouded eyes meeting Marco's. Marco just grinned, a wide, taunting display of teeth. "Sorry, old man. Guess you'll have to start over." He leaned back into his booth, basking in the fear and silence he had created. He had thrown a rock into a quiet pond, and now he was enjoying the ripples. Ilara had seen the whole thing. She stood by the service station, a coffee pot in her hand. The glass felt hot, the handle digging into her palm. She watched Arthur slowly, painstakingly, try to dab at his wet sleeve with a dry napkin, his arthritic fingers clumsy. He didn't complain. He didn't cry out. He simply absorbed the insult, his shoulders slumping, the light in his eyes dimming. It was the quiet dignity of his retreat that broke something in her. She was not a hero. She had spent years running from the kind of confrontation that was now unfolding 10 feet away. Safety was invisibility. Silence was survival. This was the code she lived by. But her father had taught her another code, a deeper one. He had been an architect, a man who believed in structural integrity above all else. A foundation must be sound, he told her, 1,000 times. A support must bear its load. A design that allows for the corrosion of its weakest point is a failed design. She looked at Arthur, a weak point being deliberately corroded. She looked at Marco, the agent of that corrosion. and she looked at Valerius. He was still watching. He had seen the entire exchange. His face remained impassive, but his eyes for the first time were focused. He was not looking at Marco or at Arthur. He was looking at her. It was not a challenge. It was an observation, a question suspended in the silent, heavy air. "What kind of structure are you?" The heat from the coffee pot traveled up her arm, a slow spreading warmth. It was a choice, to remain a ghost, to let the moment pass, to wipe down another counter and pour another cup and disappear into the background, or to become solid, to become a load-bearing wall, to demonstrate that even in a world of decay, some things still had integrity. She felt the delicate, brittle framework of her self-imposed exile begin to crack. She did not walk toward the booth of power. She walked toward the booth of vulnerability. Each step was a decision, a quiet declaration. The worn soles of her shoes made a soft, whispering sound on the linoleum. She stopped beside Arthur's table. He looked up at her, his expression lost. She reached down and gently took the soiled, ruined napkin from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin was as cool and dry as old paper. She placed it on her tray. Then, with a clean, dry cloth from her apron, she bent and carefully blotted the water from the sleeve of his jacket. She didn't speak. The action was the entire sentence. It was a shield. It was a statement of allegiance. Arthur watched her, his eyes slowly clearing. A flicker of understanding, of gratitude, dawned in them. He straightened his shoulders just a fraction of an inch. It was enough. Marco, from his booth, watched the silent exchange with a sneer. His little act of cruelty was being undone, his power subtly challenged by a waitress. The attention was no longer on him. This would not stand. "Hey!" The word cracked like a whip in the quiet room. "We need more coffee. Now." He snapped his fingers, a sharp, ugly sound that made the woman at the next table jump. Alara finished blotting Arthur's sleeve. She folded the cloth and placed it back in her apron pocket. She gave Arthur a final small nod, a promise that the world was not entirely without order. Then she turned. She did not look angry. She did not look afraid. Her face was a placid lake, but beneath the surface tectonic plates were shifting. A decision had been made. A line had been drawn. She walked back toward the counter, her steps measured, each one landing with the finality of a gavel. She passed their booth without a glance. She went behind the counter to the coffee station, but she didn't immediately reach for the pot. Instead, her eyes fell on a small framed photograph tucked behind the sugar dispensers. It was her and her father standing on a construction site. He had his arm around her, a blueprint clutched in his other hand. He was smiling, his face alight with pride and passion for his work. It was a picture from before the betrayal, before the theft of his life's work, before the corporate entity that had crushed him had in turn crushed her. His voice echoed in her memory, not a phantom sound, but a principle as real and solid as steel. Every line has a cost, Ilara. In a drawing, in a building, in a life. You must account for it. You must charge for it. Otherwise, the whole structure becomes a lie. She looked at Marco, who was now drumming his thick fingers on the table, an impatient, arrogant rhythm. He believed his actions were free. He believed his disrespect had no cost. He was wrong. The structure was about to be corrected. Ilara reached for the coffee pot. Her movements became a study in deliberation. The cheap glass pot, which minutes before had been a simple tool, was now an instrument. The coffee inside, dark and steaming, was no longer a beverage. It was a medium of transaction. She held it not with the casual grip of a waitress, but with the steady hand of a surgeon. She walked from behind the counter, her path taking her directly to their booth. The silence in the diner was now absolute, a thick, pressurized blanket. Sal had appeared in the kitchen doorway, a spatula held forgotten in his hand. The two other customers were frozen, their forks halfway to their mouths. They were all watching the slow, inevitable collision of two worlds. Elara stopped at the edge of the table. Marco looked up at her, his mouth opening to deliver another crude command, but the words died in his throat. He saw her eyes. The gray was no longer distant and neutral. It was focused, sharp, the color of polished steel. There was a clarity there he did not understand, and it unsettled him. She leaned forward, the coffee pot held in a perfectly steady hand. She poured the liquid into his cup. The stream was flawless, silent, filling the white ceramic vessel to within a millimeter of its brim without spilling a single drop. The precision of the act was its own kind of statement. It was controlled. It was intentional. Then she did something no one expected. She did not retreat. She remained there, holding the now empty pot, her gaze locked on Marco. She was waiting. He blinked, thrown off balance. "What are you looking at?" "Get lost." Elara didn't move. She simply held his gaze. The moment stretched. It was a silent duel of wills. Marco, accustomed to bluster and immediate capitulation, found himself adrift. He was being met not with fear, but with an unnerving, solid calm. He was a wave crashing against a stone seawall. Finally she straightened up. She turned and walked back to the counter, but she did not resume her tasks. Instead, she took a small green guest check pad from its slot. She uncapped a pen. The click was unnervingly loud in the stillness. Her penmanship, when she wrote, was not the hurried scrawl of a server. It was precise, angular, the lettering of a draftsman. Each character was formed with an architect's care. The other customers watched, transfixed. Valerius, who had seemed lost in his own world, was now fully present. His eyes, narrowed slightly, followed her every move. He was no longer just observing. He was analyzing. He was reading the lines of a blueprint he hadn't known existed. Elara wrote 2 lines on the small green slip. Coffee refill, $1 service charge, $39. She drew a firm, straight line beneath the numbers. Then she wrote the total, $40. It was not a bill. It was a verdict. It was an accounting for a debt incurred not in coffee, but in dignity. Every line has a cost. She had calculated it. Now it was time to deliver the invoice. She tore the slip from the pad with a soft, decisive rip. Then her eyes scanned the counter, past the napkin dispenser, past the salt shakers, and landed on the heavy black metal stapler Sal used for closing takeout bags. It sat there, solid and dense, an object of brutalist utility, a tool for binding things together, or for making a point. She picked up the stapler. It felt heavy and cool in her hand, a solid piece of industrial design. It was not a weapon. It was an instrument of punctuation. She held it loosely at her side, the green bill pinched between her thumb and forefinger. She turned from the counter. The room watched her, a collection of held breaths. Arthur, in his corner booth, sat straighter now, his old eyes wide with a dawning, fearful astonishment. He was seeing the quiet waitress he knew transform into something else, something he could not name, but which resonated with an ancient, undeniable authority. Elara walked back toward the table. Her steps were the same as before, soft, measured, silent, but the intention behind them had changed the very air around her. She was no longer a ghost. She was a reckoning. Marco and his partner were muttering to each other, their bravado curdling into confusion. Marco saw her coming. What now? You forget something? He tried for a sneer, but it wavered. The certainty he had possessed just minutes ago was gone, replaced by a prickling unease. She did not answer. She didn't even look at his face. Her eyes were fixed on a point on his chest, on the cheap, slightly shiny fabric of his suit jacket's lapel. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he had to lean back. He could smell the faint scent of coffee and cleaning solution, but beneath it, something else, the clean, metallic scent of resolve. The other thug, the one with the walnut knuckles, started to shift in his seat. His hand moved instinctively toward the inside of his jacket. He was a man trained to recognize threats, and his instincts were screaming at him that the established order of things was about to be violently overturned. But a single movement from the man in the corner of the booth stopped him cold. Valerius raised a hand, just an inch, a quiet, absolute command to stay put. His eyes never left Ilara. He was not intervening. He was allowing the event to unfold. He was a connoisseur of power, and he had just discovered a rare, unexpected vintage. He wanted to see its finish. Ilara raised her left hand, the one holding the small green bill. She laid it flat against Marco's lapel. The paper was a stark, jarring rectangle against the dark fabric. Marco froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" She did not answer with words. Her right hand came up, bringing the heavy metal stapler with it. The motion was not fast. It was a fluid, deliberate arc, like the swing of a pendulum. There was no anger in it. There was only the pure, cold logic of an action reaching its conclusion. The sound it made was shocking in its intimacy, a solid, mechanical thunk click. It was the sound of a single metal staple being driven through the paper, through the fabric of the lapel, and clinching shut on the other side. It was a sound of finality, a sound of attachment, a sound of a debt being irrevocably fixed to its debtor. For a heartbeat there was nothing, just the image, frozen in the thick, silent air of the diner. The waitress, her face calm and unreadable. The thug, his face a canvas of stunned, slack-jawed outrage. And the small green bill stapled neatly to his chest like a specimen tag. Then the silence shattered. Marco's shock detonated into pure rage. A guttural roar tore from his throat. He lunged, not even thinking to remove the bill, his hands clawing for her. "You crazy!" His attack was clumsy, fueled by ego and humiliation. It was the lunge of a street brawler expecting a flinch, a scream, a pathetic retreat. He did not get one. What happened next was not a fight. A fight implies a contest. This was a correction. It was the precise, immediate deconstruction of a threat by a force that understood structure and leverage on a level Marco couldn't begin to comprehend. Ilara didn't step back. She pivoted, a slight turn on the ball of her left foot, her body flowing around his charge like water around a rock. Her left hand, the one that had held the bill, came up, not to block his grabbing hand, but to meet his wrist. Her fingers curled around the bone and tendon with a grip that was shockingly strong. It wasn't the grip of a waitress. It was the grip of someone who understood anatomy as a series of levers and fulcrums. Simultaneously, her right hand, the one that had held the stapler, came to rest flat against his chest. It wasn't a punch. It was a placement, a point of contact. For a fraction of a second they were connected. His forward momentum, her redirecting grip, her anchored hand, All the force of his own attack, all his rage and weight, was suddenly gathered, redirected, and returned to him. She pushed. It was a small, economical movement, no effort wasted, but it was applied to the exact point where his balance was most compromised. Marco, expecting to grab and tear, found himself weightless, his feet leaving the floor as his own momentum carried him backward over a fulcrum he hadn't known was there. He stumbled, his arms windmilling, and crashed back into his own table. The impact was a cacophony of shattering ceramic and clattering silverware. The coffee cup exploded. Sugar packets sprayed into the air like shrapnel. The table tilted, one leg scraping across the linoleum. With a piercing shriek, Marco landed half in the booth, half out, dazed, and covered in coffee and sugar, the green bill still stapled firmly to his chest. The diner was a tomb. The other thug was halfway out of his seat, his hand now visibly gripping the butt of a pistol beneath his jacket, his face a mask of disbelief. But he was looking at his boss. Valerius hadn't moved. His posture was the same, his hands resting on the table, but his face had changed. The impassive mask was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, focused interest. He was looking at Elara as if seeing her for the first time. He saw it all in that single, fluid sequence of movements, the economy of motion, the lack of fear, the perfect understanding of force and counterforce. This was not a lucky dodge. This was discipline. This was training. This was an architecture of violence hidden beneath a placid surface. A memory surfaced in Elara's mind, sharp and clear. Her father, in his workshop, showing her a model of a building designed to withstand an earthquake. It's not about resisting the force, Elara. You can't fight an earthquake. It's about absorbing the energy, redirecting it, and letting the structure sway without breaking. You don't defeat the force, you use it. He had been talking about steel and concrete, but he had also been talking about life. She had spent 5 years resisting, trying to build rigid walls around herself. And now, in one moment of pure instinct, she had remembered how to sway. The quiet in the room was finally broken by a voice. It was low, calm, and carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Enough. It was Valerius. He spoke the single word without raising his voice, yet it cut through the tension like a razor. The thug with the gun froze completely, his hand still inside his jacket. Marco, struggling to untangle himself from the wreckage of the table, stopped moving. Valerius slowly, deliberately pulled a thick folded roll of bills from the inside pocket of his immaculate suit. He didn't count them. He peeled one bill from the outside, a $100 note. He placed it on the undamaged corner of the table. "For the coffee," he said, his voice still quiet, "and the inconvenience." His eyes then moved to Marco. The look was not one of fury. It was colder than that. It was the look of a man disposing of a faulty tool. There was a flicker of something else, too. Contempt. Not for the waitress, but for his own man, who had so spectacularly misjudged the situation, who had mistaken restraint for weakness, and who had brought this humiliation upon them. "Get out." The two words were a death sentence for Marco's pride. Marco stared, his face a mottled red of shame and fury. The bill on his chest seemed to burn him. He wanted to argue, to protest, to salvage some shred of his shattered ego. But one look at Valerius's face and the fight drained out of him. He scrambled to his feet, pulling at the lapel, trying to hide the stapled bill. The other thug, his face pale, backed away from the table and moved toward the door. Without another word, the two men fled. They didn't walk. They stumbled, a disorganized retreat. The bell on the door gave a frantic, clattering jingle as they burst out into the afternoon light, their departure as chaotic as their entrance had been imposing. They were not wolves. They were hyenas, routed and scattered. The diner remained silent, the aftermath hanging in the air like dust. Ilara stood by the ruined table, her breathing even, her hands at her sides. She was no longer a ghost. She was a monolith, a fixed point around which the chaos had just broken. Valerius did not leave. He picked up his coffee cup, which had miraculously survived the ordeal, and took a slow sip. His dark eyes were on Ilara, and the assessment was complete. He had come into a cheap diner and found something priceless. He had been looking for muscle. He had found integrity. He saw the woman who had brought him coffee. But now he also saw the architect beneath. The silence that followed was not the tense, fearful silence from before. It was a silence of awe. Sal, the cook, stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, spatula still in hand, his mouth slightly agape. The two other customers, a middle-aged couple, were staring at Ilara with a mixture of terror and admiration. In the corner, Arthur sat bolt upright, his old eyes shining. He looked from the wreckage of the booth to Ilara, and a slow smile spread across his face. He picked up his pen and a fresh napkin and began to draw, not a puzzle this time, but a single, perfect, unbreachable tower. Ilara moved. The spell was broken. She went to the service station, retrieved a dustpan and brush, and began to sweep up the shards of the broken coffee cup. Her movements were the same as before, economical, precise, quiet, but the context had changed. It was no longer the action of an invisible servant. It was the action of a person restoring order to her own space. She was not cleaning up their mess. She was resetting her world. Valerius watched her. He didn't speak. He simply sat in his booth, nursing his coffee, his presence a silent, powerful observation. The $100 bill lay on the table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood grain. Ilara swept around it, ignoring it completely. The money was not the point. The transaction had already been completed, the account settled. She gathered the broken ceramic, the sugar-dusted debris, and disposed of it. She righted the table and wiped it clean with a damp cloth. Within minutes, the physical evidence of the confrontation was gone. All that remained was the memory and the palpable shift in the diner's atmosphere. It was still a humble, greasy spoon, but it was no longer a place of quiet desperation. It now possessed a center of gravity. Finally, Valerius finished his coffee. He placed the cup down with a soft click. He slid out of the booth, his movements as fluid and silent as when he had arrived. He walked not to the door, but to the counter where Ilara was now rinsing a rag in the sink. He stopped a few feet from her. She did not turn. She continued her work, her back to him. He waited. He was a man unaccustomed to waiting for anyone, but he did so now. He was not exercising power. He was showing respect. At last she turned off the water, squeezed the rag dry, and faced him. Her expression was neutral, her gray eyes clear and calm. She was not intimidated. She was not triumphant. She was simply present. Valerius looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who lived in a world of lies, of masks, of performative strength. He had built an empire on his ability to see through facades, to find the true structure beneath the ornamentation. And looking at her now, he saw no facade at all. He saw something pure, something forged in a fire he could only guess at. He saw a foundation that was perfectly, terrifyingly sound. "My name is Valerius," he said. It was not an introduction. It was an offering. "I know," she replied. Her voice was steady. He nodded slowly. He reached into his jacket, and for a second the air tensed again. But he did not produce a weapon or more money. He brought out a slim, elegant silver case and extracted a business card. He placed it on the counter between them. It was thick, heavy stock, the lettering a simple embossed black. It bore only his name and a single phone number. "My associates are enthusiastic," he said, the word dripping with dry irony. "They lack an appreciation for subtlety, for structure." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "That was an impressive piece of deconstruction, the way you used his own momentum. It was not the work of a waitress." Ilara said nothing. The silence was her answer. He gestured with his chin toward the card. "I am in the business of building things. Sometimes I find I have a greater need for architects than for demolition crews. You have a rare talent for understanding stress and failure points, a talent that is being wasted here." He let the statement hang in the air. It was not a job offer. It was a recognition. It was an opening of a door into a world she had long since abandoned. She looked down at the card, at the name, at the number. Then she looked back up at him. "I'm not for hire," she said. He almost smiled. It was a bare twitch of the muscles at the corner of his mouth, but on his face it was as expressive as a laugh. "I am not looking to hire you," he said. "I am looking to retain a consultant. There is a difference. Good architects are not employees. They are partners." He turned and walked toward the door, his expensive shoes making no sound on the worn floor. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had placed his piece on the board. The next move was hers. As he reached the door, he paused and glanced back at the $100 bill still sitting on the table. "Keep it," he said, "for the damages and for the lesson." Then he was gone. The bell gave a soft, final jingle, and the diner returned to what it was. And yet, it was entirely changed. Ilara looked at the card on the counter. She looked at Arthur, who raised his coffee cup to her in a silent toast. She looked at the $100 bill. She walked over, picked it up, and slid it into the pocket of her apron. Then she went to the register and rang up a single coffee. $1. She placed the remaining $99 into the tip jar, a cracked glass mug with the word "Thanks" painted on it in faded red letters. The structure had been balanced. The account was closed. For now. Days melted into a familiar rhythm, but the underlying melody had changed. The diner was the same, the customers were the same, but Ilara moved through the space with a different weight. The invisibility she had cultivated for so long had been stripped away, and in its place was a quiet, solid presence. The other regulars looked at her differently, with a new respect. Sal the cook stopped telling her to smile more. A new kind of order had been established, one based not on fear, but on the quiet authority she now unconsciously projected. She had not thrown the card away. It sat in the drawer of her bedside table, a small, heavy rectangle of paper in the darkness. She would sometimes take it out and look at it. Valerius. The name meant nothing and everything. It was a key to a door she had locked and sealed years ago, a door that led back to a world of ambition, design, and danger, a world that had destroyed her father. Her father had not just been an architect of buildings. He had been a pioneer in structural security. He designed systems, both physical and digital, that were meant to be incorruptible. His masterpiece was a project called Aegis, a fully integrated security architecture for a new global financial clearinghouse. It was a design of breathtaking elegance and integrity, a digital fortress with foundations of cryptographic bedrock. He had poured his soul into it. And then, the corporation that had commissioned it, a predatory conglomerate called Argentis International, had stolen it. They had used a loophole in his contract, a flaw in the legal structure he hadn't seen, and had taken his life's work, leaving him with nothing but legal fees and a broken heart. He had died a year later, not from any specific illness, but from a failure of his own internal structure. The load had been too great. Ilara had been his apprentice, his prodigy. She knew the Aegis design better than anyone alive, save him. When he died, and the crushing weight of his debts fell to her, she had run. She had changed her name, shed her past, and sought refuge in the anonymous, undemanding world of service work. She had tried to forget the language of blueprints and stress tests, but the principles were too deeply ingrained. 1 week after the incident at the diner, as she was leaving her small apartment building for her shift, the car was there, the same black sedan parked at the curb, its tinted windows like the blank eyes of a shark. It did not feel like a threat. It felt like an appointment. The back door opened. Valerius stepped out. He was not wearing a suit this time, but a dark cashmere overcoat that seemed to drink the gray morning light. He did not have his men with him. He was alone. This was not an act of intimidation. This was a meeting of equals. He nodded to her. "Miss Ilara," he said, using a name she hadn't heard in 5 years. So he had done his research. Of course he had. "I told you I'm not interested," she said, her voice flat. She clutched the strap of her bag, the only sign of her tension. "I know what you told me," he replied, his voice calm. "I am not here to repeat my offer. I am here to provide context." He gestured to the open door of the car. "Walk with me." It was phrased as an invitation, but it held the quiet weight of a command she felt compelled to obey. Hesitantly, she walked beside him down the quiet residential street. "There is a corporation," he began, his voice a low murmur. "Argentis International. They are a competitor, not in my usual lines of business. They are parasites. They acquire, they strip, they liquidate. They do not build, they demolish." Ilara's heart began to beat a little faster. The name was a key turning a lock deep inside her. "They are currently trying to force a hostile takeover of a philanthropic foundation I control," he continued, "a medical research trust my mother established before she passed away. It is the only thing my family has ever built that has a foundation of pure integrity. Argentis wants to absorb it, sell off its patents, and dissolve its mission." He paused, looking at her. "Their usual method is legal and financial warfare, but this time they are also attacking the trust's infrastructure. Digital incursions, attempts to compromise our data, to steal our research. The attacks are sophisticated. They seem to anticipate our defenses before we even erect them. It is as if they have the blueprints to our security system." Ilara stopped walking. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. She knew what he was going to say before he said it. "The security system the trust uses," Valerius said, his eyes fixed on hers, "is a commercial platform known as Aegis." The name landed like a physical blow. The fortress her father had built to be incorruptible was being used by his destroyers, and it was failing. Or more likely, Argentis had kept a master key, a hidden flaw they had built into the design after they stole it, the ultimate betrayal. Valerius watched her face, saw the flicker of pain, the sudden sharp intake of breath. He saw the confirmation he was looking for. I did not know the history of the Aegis platform when my people licensed it, he said. I do now. I know it was designed by a man named Alistair Finch. I know it was stolen from him, and I know he had a daughter, a brilliant apprentice who co-authored the original design specifications, a young woman who disappeared 5 years ago. He reached into his overcoat and produced not a card, but a thick, rolled-up document tied with a simple ribbon. He held it out to her. I believe this belongs to you. Her hands trembled as she took it. She didn't need to unroll it. She knew the weight of it, the feel of the heavy vellum paper. It was a copy of her father's original, hand-drawn schematics for Aegis, the true design, the one without the flaws, without the corporate back doors, the masterpiece, as it was meant to be. I am not asking you to work for me, Valerius said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. I am asking you to restore your father's work. Argentus defiled his legacy. They are using his genius as a weapon for their own greed. I am offering you the chance to correct that, to find the flaw they built into his design, and to use it against them, to see his work vindicated. I am offering you justice, not as a gift, but as a contract. Your expertise for my resources, a partnership. He turned and walked back to his car. This time there was no card, no phone number. He had given her the blueprints. He had given her the truth. The choice was now entirely hers, to remain Ilara the waitress, safe in her small, quiet world, or to become Ilara Finch again, the architect, and to step back onto the stage, not as a victim, but as a force of reconstruction. She stood on the cold pavement, clutching her father's legacy in her hands, the ghost of his voice in her ear. Every structure can be broken, and every broken structure can be rebuilt. If the foundation is true, time began to move differently. The slow, repetitive cycle of the diner compressed and fell away, replaced by a rapid, forward momentum. The days of wiping counters and pouring coffee were over, relegated to a past that felt like another lifetime. Weeks blurred into a montage of intense, focused work. The new setting was not a cramped apartment, but a sprawling empty floor in one of Valerius's downtown towers. It was a space of raw potential, with concrete floors, exposed ductwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city. In the center of this vast emptiness, Ilara had set up her workshop. 2 long trestle tables, a high-end server rack humming quietly in the corner, and a single powerful workstation, and spread across the tables, held down by polished steel weights, were her father's blueprints. She was no longer in a waitress's uniform. She wore simple black trousers and a gray silk blouse, clothing that was functional yet elegant, a reflection of her own restored sense of self. Her hair was pulled back, her face lit by the cool glow of a monitor, her eyes alive with the intellectual fire that had been banked for so long. She was not a ghost anymore. She was the chief architect. She spent hours, then days, poring over the original designs, her mind sinking back into the familiar, intricate logic of the Aegis system. It was like coming home. The cryptographic algorithms, the redundant data pathways, the physical security protocols, it all came back to her. The language of her father, the language of her own soul. She was rebuilding her own internal structure as she reacquainted herself with his masterpiece. Valerius would visit, often late at night. He never announced his arrival. He would simply appear, a silent figure in a dark suit, standing near the windows, looking out at the city lights. He never interrupted her. He would watch her work, his presence a quiet, steady support. He was the client, the patron, the man with immense power, but in this room he deferred to her. He recognized that her expertise was a form of power greater than his own in this specific domain. He had provided the space, the resources. She provided the genius. It was a true partnership. One evening he found her staring at a specific section of the blueprint, her face a mask of intense concentration. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "A signature," she said, without looking up. She pointed to a complex subroutine governing remote data access. When Argentis stole the design, they had to rewrite parts of the code to integrate it with their own systems. The lead programmer at Argentis at the time was a man named Kovic. He had a reputation for arrogance. He liked to leave a signature in his code, a specific inefficient sequence that was his alone. It was a mark of ego. My father called it a structural flaw. She tapped the screen of her monitor, where she had isolated a string of code from the current Argentis-controlled Aegis system. And there it is, the same inefficient sequence, the same signature. It's the back door. It's the flaw Kovic built in for himself, a way for Argentis to always have master access. Valerius looked from the screen to her face. A flaw. "Every design has one," she said, a faint echo of her father in her tone. "The trick is knowing how to exploit it." Kovic designed this as a door for him to walk through. He never imagined someone else might find the key. This isn't just a back door, it's a vulnerability. I can use it not just to lock them out, but to walk right into their own systems. I can use their weapon against them. For the first time since she had met him, Valerius allowed himself a genuine cold smile. "Then do it," he said. "Demolish them." The confrontation was not a physical one. It was silent, digital, and utterly devastating. From her command center high above the city, Ilara launched her counterattack. It was not a brute force assault. It was a piece of architectural artistry. She used the very back door Argentis had created, a flaw born of arrogance, to enter their network. She didn't smash her way in. She slid through the cracks in their foundation, her movements as silent and precise as her footsteps in the diner. Once inside, she did not steal money or delete files. That was their way, not hers. Instead, she did two things. First, she found the true, unredacted contracts and internal memos detailing the theft of her father's work, the evidence of their crime, which they had buried deep in their archives. Second, she triggered a cascade failure based on Kovic's own flawed code, a logic bomb that didn't destroy data, but locked it. Every file, every record, every piece of their operational infrastructure was suddenly, irrevocably encrypted, with a key that only she possessed. Argentis International was frozen solid. The final piece of her design was an automated, anonymous data dump. The evidence of their theft of the Aegis project, along with proof of dozens of other hostile, predatory actions, was sent to a select list of financial journalists and federal regulators. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Argentis's stock plummeted. Federal investigations were launched. Their board was gutted. The company, a titan of corporate rating, was brought to its knees not by a rival corporation, but by a ghost from their past, by the legacy of a man they had destroyed. Months later, the vast office floor was no longer empty. It was the bustling headquarters of the newly independent Valerius Medical Trust, secured by the true uncompromised Aegis system. Ilara stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city. She was now the head of the Trust's entire security division, a position created for her. She was not an employee. Her title was Chief Architect. Valerius came to stand beside her. He followed her gaze out at the sprawling metropolis, a vast, complex structure of steel, glass, and human ambition. Argentus is gone, he said, liquidated, its assets absorbed by more competent predators. Your father has been vindicated. His name is now attached to the Aegis project in every official record. Elara nodded, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. The debt was paid. The structure was restored. You have a home here, he said, for as long as you want it. I know, she said. She looked around the office at the people working, at the systems she had built to protect them. She had not just found a job. She had reclaimed her purpose. She had rebuilt her father's legacy, and in doing so had rebuilt herself. She thought of the diner, of the feel of the heavy stapler in her hand, of the moment she had chosen to become solid. It had been an act of defiance, an act of justice for an old man and his ruined drawing, but it had also been the first step in her own reconstruction. Valerius left her there, returning to his own work, leaving her with the city and her thoughts. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer the hands of a waitress, soft and anonymous. They were the hands of an architect capable and sure. She had learned the hardest lesson her father had ever tried to teach her, that true power was not the ability to demolish, but the integrity to build. It is the only structure that can withstand the weight of the world, and the only one worth leaving behind.